Okay, looks like we are live. Welcome everyone to Philosophy for a Small Planet. And this is going to be a conversation about Mickey 17, the philosophy of Mickey 17, with me and my good friend Nicholas, who's also the co-writer of our upcoming book on writing stories that matter, how to use ethics to tell stories that change the world. That's our working title at the moment. And so, yeah, we both went and saw Mickey 17, and we wanted to talk about some of the ideas that it has a lot of interesting ethical ideas in it. It's Bong Joon Ho's new movie that it's about a guy who becomes what's called an expendable. He has his whole body and mind kind of saved so that he can be reprinted. And he does this in order to escape a debt collector who likes to watch his people who can't pay their debts suffer and die. And and being an expendable, he's basically someone that they can be killed over and over again and be reprinted. And he goes on this mission to a new planet called Niflheim. And that's the basic premise of the story. So I think we'll start by just, this conversation will have a lot of spoilers in it. But before we get to that, we'll just start by talking about, was it a good movie? Should you go see it? If you haven't seen it, is it worth your time? So Nick, what was your experience of the movie?
I thought it was like a very good sci-fi romp. It had like a lot of like humorous moments in it, and it was a lot of fun, a lot of twists and turns. As far as like a movie that fits in our genre of stories that matter, it's more like from a philosophical standpoint, like smatterings of ideas. Whereas it doesn't have like a very strong like grand narrative that runs through it. But I think it's, so would I call it like, one of these like movies for the ages that, is really, really like leaves you just, feeling something afterwards for years on end. No, but it's definitely a really fun movie.
Yeah, I kind of had a similar sense of it. Like it explores a lot of really interesting ideas, but just very briefly. So it asks more questions than it answers. I like that. I like movies that ask more questions than they answer, and you have to kind of think about it. But at the same time, it doesn't have time to really delve deeply into any one question. And it's like you said, it's a dark comedy, but it's also a comedy that I don't think I laughed once during. It's funny kind of in an intellectual way. It's like, okay, that's funny, but it's not like you're going to be, laughing uproariously.
I laughed about it more after the movie when I would tell you about it. More about it then, because the movie's kind of shocking and a little bit gruesome at times.
Yeah, that's another thing. If you don't like, gruesomeness and violence, like it starts pretty soon into the movie. You get like this montage of all these different ways that Mickey dies, some of which are kind of gross, vomiting blood and like.
Yeah, it's not horror, but it's, what is it like? If horror, if like Saw was 10 and a Disney movie was 1, it's like a 4 or something like that.
Yeah, somewhere in there. But so I think it's definitely worth seeing, especially if you're interested in like movies that bring up philosophical issues. But should it be at the top of your list? Probably not, But yeah. So now, having said that, if you're interested, go watch it. But now we're going to get into kind of analyzing it more. And of course, we'll be talking about spoilers for the whole movie. So if you don't want to see those, then come back after you've seen the movie.
One last thing about it. A very large amount of the sci-fi out there is really just action films dressed up with a sci-fi aesthetic. It's not really about the future and like, what it would be like to live in the future. This movie really is like a science fiction movie. So that's also a good reason to go see it, I think, because there's just so many of those movies, coming out.
Yeah, that really like takes some idea and then creates a whole setting around it and explores it.
Yeah. What if you could print a human being, right? That's the premise. I'm not giving you any spoilers because that's in the trailer.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. Like it explores. So afterwards, I was thinking about like, well, what if we could print human beings? Like, there's so many other things that you could do with that aren't explored in this movie. And actually, this morning I was watching some different YouTube videos about the philosophy of Mickey 17, seeing what else is out there, what people are talking about. And one thing that was brought up is that in the book, there are specific reasons why they can't just like store everybody's information and make copies, and so anybody can be resuscitated or reprinted, because like there's a resource constraint in terms of storage space. It takes a ton of storage space to store all the information of like where all the molecules in your body are and all your memories. And then the other is in this particular setting of the spaceship, they are very resource constrained in terms of protein. Like their food is rationed, and the way that they are able to reprint him is that all the waste goes into this like melting thing that then they have all this biological material that they can use to reprint him. But there's a resource constraint that they can't just copy everyone. So it's like, plus there's also like, this is in the movie, there's different beliefs about copying people and whether that's ethical and whether that's, religiously allowed.
Right. Yeah, that's always a case in like science fiction novels. They provide the constraints for the story because otherwise, you start imagining like, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that? Like the classic Dune, right? Like they've outlawed like AI and like all these technologies. So that's why it's more like it's fantasy novel, right? With like magic kind of skills. So, or The Giver, right? They've got like a bunch of constraints in that one. So, yeah, I guess they didn't have time. I mean, the movie's quite long, so they probably just didn't have time to get into those constraints.
Yeah, Dune is that classic. Like, how can I twist this science fiction setting so that I can have sword fights?
Yeah, exactly. How can I tickle that childlike side of me? Oops, and so together.
Okay, so yeah, let's start talking about some of the philosophical ideas in this. I mean, the obvious one, of course, is cloning, and you have this character who dies repeatedly, and then one interesting thing that comes up is they think he dies, so they print a new one, but he doesn't actually die, and then he comes back and finds that there's another version of himself. And so this brings up all kinds of questions about like personal identity. Can there be only one me, or if there's a copy of me, is that also me, or is that a different person? Like, what thoughts do you have about that?
Well, yeah. So just like in terms of ethics, right? Like there's all kinds of ethical questions that could be explored. They weren't explored too much, but the ethics of identity is like a big area of ethics. Like, if a person is more likable, for instance, do they deserve to die? Are they more expendable? And the movie does treat like it treats the more aggressive version of him in that way, right? Guess who survives, right? The guy who's actually very agreeable and nice, right? But the guy who's the guy who is more aggressive, right? Because they have different personality types. The guy who's more aggressive, he's also like brings into the guy's more aggressive, Mickey 18. He brings more I think he changes Mickey 17 to realize that he needs to, he kind of does what he needs to do. Like Mickey 17 is a pushover. And yeah, so I thought it was kind of interesting because normally in a story, a person changes throughout the story. But in this case, like the future, almost like the future version of Mickey that we'd like to see exists at the exact same time as the like current version without any of the like steps in between. And then they kind of go on a journey together in which it kind of transforms 17 to some degree.
Yeah, it's like you have the character arc that usually happens over time of like the main character developing in personality traits that uh, he doesn't have that would benefit him. But instead of like that happening over time, it's simultaneous. Like you have two different versions of him, and they have different strengths and weaknesses, and you see how they interact with each other. I mean, so there's a philosopher, Derek Parfit, who writes about personal identity and ethics, and he wrote a paper called Later Selves and Moral Principles, where he talks about this. And actually, there's another YouTube video that I found by Simon Cushing, who talks a lot about Derek Parfit, and he has a video about Mickey 7. Actually, he has a book out, the book Mickey 7, that the movie is based on. So that's worth watching if you're interested. But yeah, Derek Parfit talks about how there's kind of like two ways that we could see personal identity. There's what he calls the simple view, which is that like my identity is this additional fact about me. It's a further fact that isn't just about any particular traits, or it's like a fundamental important thing that persists through time, like a soul, for example. But it doesn't, you don't have to believe in a soul to have this simple view. That so my meanness is like something that's additional to my characteristics or whatever. And then the complex view is that my personal identity is just a sum total of all the things about me. And as those things change over time, I can become less myself, and I can sort of become someone else. And like, for example, this has ethical implications in dessert, or what we deserve, not ice cream. So like if a criminal commits a crime, somebody is in a gang as a teenager and commits a drive-by shooting and kills a rival gang member, but also like his wife and two kids and a dog, like that's pretty terrible. That person goes to jail. 20 years later, he says, I'm not the same person who did that. Whether we're likely to believe that and say, yeah, maybe you should get off because you've changed, or no, you're the same person. It depends on somewhat on whether we have this simple view or this complex view of like personal identity. Do we have a fundamental, identity that's just there and persists through time, or as that person changes over time, do they become no longer the person who did that crime and no longer deserving that life in prison? So with Mickey 17, again, we have these two versions of Mickey who are around at the same time. And
our moral sense about them is different.
Yeah, because they have different traits. So Mickey 17 is very meek and kind of like just accepts his fate. Like they treat him as a lab rat and, expose him to the viruses on this new planet, and over and over and over, as he like dies horribly, vomiting blood, until they come up with a vaccine that works. And I mean, there's also some, I think, reference to like animal ethics there in terms of the way that we experiment on animals, but we can get to that later. But anyway, he just kind of goes along with it. Mickey 17 is very meek and just accepts his fate, whereas Mickey 18 he has some of the traits of sociopathy, one of which is less empathy, and another one is more more risk taking. So do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because you write about that some in the book.
Yeah. So, people's traits, they're kind of an impediment to their ethics, right? Like you could have really a strong sense of justice, but never like get off your ass and do anything, right? Which I think a lot of people are in that position in the country right now. And it's the same thing for this character, right? Like I would say that Mickey 17 has a strong sense of justice and kindness. He does these things willingly, like completely, he signed this contract to become an expendable, and he did it, unknowingly. But even once he's in it, like he doesn't complain. He just kind of goes along with it, and he smiles his way through it. Um, he's extremely passive, and so that shows like he has like a real desire just to be nice, to be kind to people, right? But he doesn't have the traits to like stand up for kindness. When like other people are, when he sees things that are going on that are not good, he doesn't have the strength to stand up. But what's interesting is when his second version comes along, who's got probably some traits of sociopathy, right? The guy is a risk taker, just takes blatant risks, is impulsive. He has like lower empathy for people in certain ways, like to the point that he's willing to just like, he just kind of makes a decision half cocked, like let's kill that guy, like he does that like twice in the movie, like let's just kill him, And what's interesting is when his other self tries to kill somebody, the wimpy self that never stands up for himself all of a sudden stands up for something, like tries to stop the self that's trying to kill people. But that it's such a interesting recursive thing or meta thing. Like he's trying to stop that his other self for killing people, for doing the things that he himself feels really angry with other people for having doing, but this anger is like repressed inside of him. And it's almost like the two of them are balancing each other out. Like one experiences the traits are just so sociopathic that he needs the like super empathetic wimpy side to kind of balance them in that struggle where they're fighting with each other. They're almost like balancing themselves. It's pretty interesting, I thought.
Yeah, so you get to see again like the internal dynamics of the character, but externalized.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, so to add a little more detail there in terms of what happens in the movie, like after they discover that there's two of them, and they fight, and then Mickey 17, the meek one, gets taken off to eat a dinner with the leader of this expedition to colonize this planet, who himself is a very interesting character to talk about. His name is Kenneth Marshall. He's played by Mark Ruffalo, who it seems to be is doing kind of a Trump impression. Bong Joon Ho says he's not Trump, but just an amalgamation of different dictators. But Mark Ruffalo's performance is pretty Trumpish. But anyway, this leader of the colony takes Mickey 17 off to this dinner where he gives him this experimental new meat that they've grown, and he starts like vomiting, and then they give him an experimental new painkiller to see if it helps with the vomiting, and it makes things worse. He gets like this allergic reaction and almost dies, or they almost just shoot him. Like the leader almost just shoots him because it's like he's in too much pain. Let's just shoot him and print a new one. But he ends up living through it. And when he comes back and tells Mickey 18 what happened to him, Mickey 18 is like, "What? They did that to you? We have to go kill him." So there's this interesting thing where Mickey 18 doesn't seem to have much empathy for most people, but he has a lot of empathy for Mickey 17 because it's like another him.
But he also tried to kill.
He also tried to kill him.
Yeah.
He's like, because so the reason he tried to kill him is because in this world, there's like this, speaking of the simple view of like our identity as being this further fact about us, in this weird religion that they have, they decided that there's only one soul per body. So if you make multiple copies of the same person, then they don't have a soul. Like if when you successfully make new copies of the same person, then I guess he can still have a soul, because there's not two of them at the same time. But if you have two versions of the same person, then there's some issue because like there's only one soul per body. So you're not allowed to have multiples, and if there are multiples, then they all have to be killed. And so
that's a better reason than what they used in the movie.
So that's one of the reasons they use in the movie. The other reason they use in the movie is that one of the people who developed this technology was a serial killer and used it to create alibis for himself. And then after that, they decided that there's only one soul per body.
Well, and that's also where, I think they fell short on, like, we were talking about the ethics of, identity. Like, all of the guys were killers, right?
Yeah.
And it would have been more interesting if one of them wasn't a killer, I guess they tapped into a little bit because they couldn't, like, initially, or when one guy started killing people and they caught him, they couldn't arrest the others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the assumption was, well, this is one person, but then the others started killing people too. So then it was like they're all the same, right? They all have the same dysfunction. But the reason the law wasn't able to protect people was because of that it treated them as separate people. So I guess they did get into that a little bit.
Yeah. So anyway, we were talking about how Mickey 18 responds to an injustice against Mickey 17 by going to kill the leader. And then Mickey 17 is like, no, you can't do that. And he starts to become active when he sees his other self about to do something bad. So it's like, there's this sense of identity they have. They still feel like there's some sense of identity. Like Mickey 17 feels like if my other self does this bad thing, then I've done a bad thing. And Mickey 18 feels like if they did something bad to Mickey 17, then they did something bad to me. But they're responding to the situation so differently.
Right. It's a weird thing because it's almost like responding to a child. Like a child is like a piece of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like they've done studies, right, on the genetics, like what's the likelihood someone will jump into a river and try to save someone based on how far away they're related to them. And these guys are like as related as possibly could be. So like some of those instincts might be coming into play where they're jumping in. I was going to say also, in terms of like the story's meaningfulness, something that I think is meaningful to a lot of people is, we've all like been conformist at some point and not stood up for ourselves or felt powerless to stand up for ourselves. And when to watch just the lack of empathy for Mickey 17, the abuse, the use, it's like it's an analogy for our own lives, right? Of like, movies oftentimes, or stories oftentimes, they'll use some extreme example to get you to feel something, to get you in touch with something. Because in order to like experience it in another person, it has to be more extreme. But like when you experience, if you watch a movie about somebody who's going through the same ways you were pushed over, no one's going to care. It requires some extreme situation to really amp those emotions up, to get you in touch with those emotions. And I felt like that as I watched the movie, I was really in touch with that injustice of being pushed down. And then this other character, Mickey 18, comes on, and he's like, it's funny because, like I said, he's like his actions are not moral. His instincts are not good, but at the same time, he represents this sense of catharsis. Again, he's doing something really extreme. It's almost like he has to go try to kill someone for you to feel that kind of catharsis, because he's standing up for himself. And so there's like this ethics of in the movie, I think this like personal ethics of like the virtue of being able to stand up for yourself, like developing yourself. What makes for a good person, right? A good person is someone who stands up for themselves, but who is also kind. And like, how do you navigate like being kind and standing up for yourself, right?
Yeah, they're kind of like two manifestations or two different versions of how to strike that balance, neither of which is balanced. And then like, but you do see as they go through the movie, they kind of rub off on each other a little bit and become, a little bit more moving towards that more balanced point of like being able to stand up without being cruel or callous towards others.
Right, like Mickey 18 tries to kill Mickey 17, and then he fails, and then he actually starts to care for Mickey 17, right?
Yeah, and in that sequence where they're fighting, Mickey 18 knocks out Mickey 17, and he's taking him to the place where they melt down the biological material, and he's going to dump him in there. And then Mickey 17 wakes up, and he has the drop on Mickey 18. Like, he could totally just kill him right there, but he hesitates and he doesn't do it. And then they start fighting again. And then they're about to get caught or something, so they stop fighting. But another thing that it explores, which is something else that Derek Parfit talks about, is commitment with successive selves. So, Derek Parfit suggests that our commitments may be less strong if we take this complex view of that our selves change over time. Like, if you make a commitment to someone and then that person changes or you change, how does that affect the commitment? So there's a really dark version of that in this movie, which is that the whole reason that he escaped Earth in the first place is because he has this debt to this loan shark who likes to torture people to death. And so, and he has this, he and this friend, Timo, have this debt together. And Timo is like this terrible friend who's just totally using Mickey. But Mickey doesn't really realize that because he's just such a nice, like, kind of oblivious. He's not too bright. Mickey 17 is not too bright. Mickey 18 is a little sharper. And then his friend Timo comes later in the movie when both Mickeys are in prison, and is like, hey, this loan shark sent somebody onto the ship, and he needs a video of one of us being killed in order to forgive the debt. And so, will you please let me like chainsaw you to pieces, and so it's like, does the debt still hold with the successive versions of Mickey? And then maybe the more interesting version of this commitment question is he has this romance with another character, Nasha, on the ship. And when there's two versions of Mickey, like, how does that, like, they're not married, but there's some kind of commitment there. How does that affect that commitment? And it's interesting, like, Mickey 17 is really afraid about Mickey 18 stealing Nasha from him. But when Nasha finds out that there's two of them, she's like, great, there's more Mickey for me. Now I get to have sex with two Mickeys at the same time. But then there's this other character who's like romantically interested in Mickey. And when she finds out there's two, she's like, oh, well, why don't we split them? then you don't have to worry about this commitment you have to Nasha. You can be with me, and you're not breaking your commitment. And then they kind of like don't really pursue that. They kind of just drop that plot thread. But it is one of these questions that it brings up, and then it doesn't really do much with. But it's an interesting thing to think about.
Right.
Do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's again, like I was saying in the beginning, was that there's all these little questions they kind of touch on, but that are kind of interesting, but they don't go too far into it, right? Like you could make a movie about that alone. I think
totally. I mean, there's multiplicity from like the 80s or 90s where Michael Keaton makes copies of himself, and then one of the clone sleeps with his wife, and he's like really mad.
Right. There's also, I think it has been explored a lot in different things. There's also a Paul Rudd Netflix series. Unfortunately, they didn't make a second season of. I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, he's there's two of him, and similar kind of situation. Yeah.
But we can think about like with this idea of successive selves over time, like we could think of someone saying, you're not the person I married. And there being some kind of meaning behind that, like that somebody's changed enough that they're no longer the characteristics about them that made the person make the commitment in the first place are no longer are different.
Yeah, that's funny because that comes up in our lives, right? That it's at first when we start talking about it, it sounds like this esoteric thing, like that would only happen with like multiples. But yeah, it happens in marriage, right? Like the justification for terminating the commitment is you're no longer the person I married, right?
You're not the person I made that commitment to.
Yeah, you're not the person I made that commitment to. Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's interesting that like it's obvious to the audience that the two Mickeys are very different people, and there would be every reason for Nasha to be like, you're not the Mickey that I got into this relationship with, but she totally sees them both as Mickey and both as the person that she's been in this relationship with, and doesn't see any problem at all with just continuing that commitment with both of them.
I mean, she's been with multiple versions of him.
Yeah, and like we find out, Mickey says kind of in his voiceover that Nasha says that Mickey 6 was like this and Mickey 5 was like that, and so that there's like the copies apparently aren't perfect. They have the personalities are different.
Yeah. I was going to say something that just occurred to me. So, another interesting thing about the whole standing up thing is that Nasha, she is the strong character in the thing, and it's kind of an inversion on previous movies from last century, right, where the man was always the strong one in the relationship and the protector of the woman, right? And in this one, she's the strong one. She's a cop, and he's a very meek kind of person. So it's more like, there's a yin and yang in a relationship. There's like one person who's, people try to balance each other out. They try to get the needs they can't provide for themselves. They try to get other people to provide and vice versa. And so, yeah, I thought that was interesting that also when I really felt like that catharsis against the, what's the name of the leader?
Kenneth Marshall.
Kenneth Marshall. Yeah. When you expect that catharsis to be when Mickey 18 goes and tries to kill Kenneth Marshall. But actually the real catharsis is when she stands up for Mickey 17, she starts yelling at him that he's this pretentious asshole, right?
Mm-hmm.
You really feel that, like that anger, and it almost, I think Kenneth Marshall is a stand-in for, Trump or other types of people like that in our lives. And so you like really accesses that in you. You really feel that it's the kind of the pinnacle moment where they stand up against that kind of personality, right? self-aggrandizing, not empathetic, treats women as uteruses, life support systems for uteruses, etc.
Yeah, there's this whole weird ideology of like eugenics where he's trying to breed the perfect race of humans on this planet. And I just want to put in a little, like, Toni Collette plays his wife, Ilfa, and she is like the highlight of the movie. She is just so, she plays this character who's like so ridiculous, and she's like in pursuit of the perfect sauce, because sauce is like the pinnacle of civilization, the measurement of civilization.
Define civilization, yeah.
And, oh man, she's just so good. So anyway, there's a whole other plot thread in the movie though that I want to make sure that we talk about, which is that there's these aliens living on the planet who look like bugs. They look kind of like roly polies, and they kind of like, they scuttle around. They look a little creepy, and so Kenneth Marshall, the leader, Mark Ruffalo's character, is like, well, I'm going to call them creepers because they're creepy, and he treats them immediately as this enemy that needs to be destroyed. And there's a lot of interesting things there in terms of, animal ethics, environmental ethics, but also how we respond to morally to things based on appearance and based on the feeling of disgust. So Nick, you write a lot about disgust in our book. So what do you want to say about that?
Well, it's interesting that these characters, the creepers, right? They can easily change appearance. They can be cute or they can be gross. The way they did the character design, they can be more insect-like or they can be like more cuddly almost. And the sounds they make can vary in that respect. So they kind of are like shapeshifters in that way. And so in the beginning, when you see them, they're quite grotesque, so that you're kind of lulled into that same illusion that the characters are lulled into. And then the guy names them creepers, right? Which is like an insect kind of name. And Kenneth Marshall at the end, he's dressed in kind of this self-aggrandizing military attire that's almost reminiscent of like a Nazi commander. So there's almost like a nod to the fascists, again, dealing with themes of our time that people care about right now, the fascist elements in it. And one of the things fascists do is that they name their enemies after vermin and insects. The Nazis, called the Jews rats and infestations, and that they needed to be eradicated, and that, they spread disease, and they said all these kind of things, and that their genetic makeup, you could tell by the shape of their nose that the genetic makeup of them was, they were polluting, infecting your children. If a Jew married, somebody of perfect Aryan race, that crooked nose showed you that their genes were like, infesting. So again, using like all of this kind of like, dehumanizing language that's built around activating moral disgust. So like as we activate the insula in the brain, in Robert Sapolsky's book Behave, he talks about how you can distort a person's sense of moral indignation towards someone by amping up their insula. And you can do that with exposing them to disgust imagery, and then that makes them more likely to judge the person with disdain, which then makes them more likely to act against them with violence. And so there's a little bit of there's a bit of an exploration of that dynamic in that. Kenneth Marshall is a Nazi-esque character engaging in that type of thinking, and the other characters have seen past that image, and Kenneth Marshall's trapped in it. And the only way to really get Kenneth Marshall out of it is to kill him, actually, because he's not. I mean, maybe there would have been a way to get him out if they'd had more power, but they had no choice, right? So in that situation, because he was going to mow down all of those innocent creatures.
Yeah, it plays with this kind of melodramatic formula that we're used to of the good guys versus the bad guys, and um, like if you look at Lord of the Rings, it's a classic example. The bad guys are these physically deformed, ugly orcs that you can just see by looking at them that they're evil and bad and need to be destroyed, and that's not really ever questioned. And it's good to kill orcs; it's bad to kill elves. Um, and so we have that kind of imprint in our minds of like those are the evil, bad, ugly things, and they need to be destroyed. And in this movie, like when you first see them, you're like, oh, those look like scary bug-like animals that are going to eat me. And that's actually the movie starts with Mickey 17 lying. He falls down this crevasse, and he's like uh, expecting to freeze to death. And then he sees these creatures, and he's like, oh, they're going to eat me. That's good. I'll die sooner. And they come, and instead of eating him, they kind of like pick him up and push him up out of the crevasse. And of course, he's not very bright, so he's like, "Why didn't they eat me? Is my meat bad? Because I thought I was pretty fresh." And only when he later tells other characters, they're like, "Wait, they saved you. Like they have empathy for us humans, so maybe we should have empathy for them." And so the whole last part of the movie is this conflict of like, is Kenneth Marshall going to attack and try to exterminate all of these creatures?
Yeah, he's not just attacking one; like he's going to wipe out the entire
Yeah,
race.
he's planning to dump all this. Like, so two of the creatures get into the compound or into the ship, and one of them gets killed because it like jumps on Kenneth Marshall, and so the security people shoot it and kill it, and then all the other creatures come gather around this ship and are like stampeding around it, and so Kenneth Marshall is going to dump poison gas on them and try and kill them, and he sends the Mickeys out to go talk to them. No, his wife sends the Mickeys out to go collect tails to make sauce. That's what it is. But they go to try to talk to the leader of these creatures, and the creatures are threatening to like scream so it'll explode all the heads of all the humans, and so there's this thing where the enemy that seems like the disgusting, gross, evil thing is actually very sympathetic, and the real enemy is the leader who everybody looks up to, who is just this sort of narcissistic. He has this religion, and that like the leader of the religion on the ship is also like the producer of all of the media surrounding Kenneth Marshall, and he's constantly saying, "Oh, let's do it like this so that it looks like this on the recording, and we're going to send these recordings back to Earth, and it's going to be like this historical thing." It's just kind of like this little dig at the way that politics is such a show.
Right, because that they're not just shooting things as they are. They're like trying to figure out how to spin things all the time, and it's that spin that kills Kenneth Marshall, right?
Right. Yeah. Say more about that.
Well, he like goes out to kill all of the creatures, right? He puts himself at risk in order to get this like incredible shot, which this cult leader like has convinced him to do, right? So
Yeah, it's like to get a shot of him talking to the lead creeper and like giving the ultimatum before they destroy them all.
Yeah, it's classic virtue ethics. It's vanity, it's hubris, right?
Mm-hmm.
Punished for his vanity and his hubris, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to also mention that the director, he did a movie before, I think it was before Parasite, he did a movie, Okja, which is like the main grand narrative in that movie. It's about the treatment of livestock.
Mm-hmm.
He has this like mythical, this kind of magical, almost, you know, genetically engineered creature in it that's like very cute and intelligent, and it has a special relationship with this little girl. And then there's these like industrialists who are like trying to like, you know, breed it and make it into the next like super efficient food. So it's definitely a part of, you know, the director's ethics. The director definitely cares about animal rights. So it's not like coincidental, I don't think, that these kind of themes show up in the movie. Like I say, it's just like a portfolio of like ethics. Like Okja is like focused, you know, it's focused on what its ethics is.
Mm-hmm.
Like this movie is like, it's not focused. I almost felt like the director was shoehorning his, you know, his politics into that part of the movie, right?
Yeah, it's more of a shotgun. It's just like, here's a bunch of interesting stuff. Um, and yeah, I mean, actually, in Derek Parfit's paper that I was talking about, there's a kind of like a just like a short paragraph, just side note thing where he says, you know, our if we take the complex view that our personality is not, or that our personhood, that what makes us a person is not some like innate simple soul or something like that, and it's more like a combination of all of these factors, then that also kind of blurs the line between humans and animals, because you know, in a lot of classic philosophy, humans have a certain kind of soul or have souls, and animals either don't have souls or don't have the same kind of soul, and then that makes this very clear dividing line between humans and animals. But if what makes humans morally valuable or morally, you know, worthy of moral consideration is just a whole bunch of different factors, then we could have more or less of those factors, like more or less intelligence or reason or you know, ability to feel or empathy or whatever it is that we decide is morally significant. You know, animals have all of those things, maybe some of them to lesser degrees than humans. So like, I guess, you know, with Mickey, he's got his body and his mind. His body is reprinted, and his mind is like stored in this hard drive. And it makes us wonder, like, what is the Mickeyness of Mickey? And at the same time, you know, what makes us human, and what makes us different from animals or the same as animals? I mean, Mickey, when you watch Mickey go through all of these deaths where he's being experimented on with different drugs or vaccines or viruses or radiation, it, you know, makes you think of how we experiment on animals to test our medicines, and we treat them as expendable. It's like we can go through as many animals as we need to find this medicine to save a human's life. Um, and the kind of exploitative sort of industrial scale of how our society works.
Right. The true ethical thing is to destroy the brick that he's stored in. That's where the ethical traits that allow us to grant the entity rights, you know, that and empathy they lie in the brick. And so when you like, you know, so when actually in the end, when they decide they're going to destroy the brick, that's the true like immoral moment in the film, when Kenneth Marshall's like, you know, we can't have multiples, and I'm going to destroy your hard drive that you're stored on, the brick
Mm-hmm.
hard drive, right? So that's interesting what you're saying there, that there's kind of these traits. It's not like necessarily the director was thinking about these things, like they're just kind of inherent in the way that we look at, you know, good and bad in the world, right? Like we know when we see that he's going to destroy the brick, we know, oh my God, that's wrong. But when
Mm-hmm.
he's getting killed over and over again, there's this kind of like, is that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, another question that it really asks is like, is death in itself bad, or is it just the pain that goes along with it, and that the person is no longer existing? Because if the person continues to exist, if there's still a new Mickey each time, with the same memories and the same experiences, is there something wrong with killing him in itself, or is it just that he has to suffer in all of these different ways that they kill him?
Yeah, and that's the attributes that you were talking about, going back to that allow us to grant, how'd you put it, grant, I would say grant rights to the person, but
Yeah, moral consideration.
moral consideration, that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, so that theme is in, with the bugs as well, so it's kind of runs throughout the movie. I hadn't, until you talked about it, draw the parallel between these alien creatures and the brick, which is interesting. Well, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but we can say that it exposes a certain, underlying psychology that exists in human beings, right? That the movie is exploiting either knowingly or unknowingly.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, another thing that the creepers actually have a much higher respect for life than the humans, because Mickey's friend Timo sees him at the bottom of this crevasse and is like, well, it would be dangerous for me to come down and try and rescue you, so you're okay with just dying, right? um, but then the creepers save Mickey and pull him up out of the crevasse, and then the humans kill one creeper and all of the creepers come and like stampede around the ship. They get really mad that the humans killed one creeper, whereas they keep killing Mickey over and over and over again, and in these totally callous ways, and don't really seem to care, the humans. And I think one other thing that I'd like to drill down a little bit more into, we touched on it before we closed, is we talked about how the two Mickeys have different personalities, and I think kind of like I'd like to end by talking about addressing writers directly. Like, if you're a writer and you write stories, what could you take from this movie that you could apply in your stories? And I think one interesting thing that we talked about a little bit is that the two different Mickeys have some of the same basic values. They both believe in kindness and justice to some degree, but they have very different personality traits that affect how they express those values. Mickey 17 has the moral vice or weakness of being not he doesn't have enough courage. He has a deficiency. He's maybe he doesn't have enough of that standing up for himself, and so he just lets people walk all over him. Like, he believes in justice, he believes in kindness, but he doesn't really stand up for it. And whereas Mickey 18 is he has higher risk taking, lower empathy, and that leads him to enforce his moral beliefs more more actively. So he goes to shoot this kind of horrible leader, who's been torturing all of his previous selves. Do you want to say any more about that?
No, I thought we'd covered that fairly well during the whole our discussion.
Okay. Any other tips for writers?
No, I think that basically we covered. I mean, we could have actually couched it in that way more, but yeah, I would say that all of these dynamics that you see in this film that we just discovered, you could drill down in those. You could explore those more. You can, use a smattering of them in your narratives, or you could use these things to create some sort of grand narrative. There's a lot of interesting ideas in this film that you could draw on and further develop. And it's important to ask, what's important to your audience. would a movie about, relationships, marriage is really important, fidelity is really important to people. So the narrative with the the dynamics that existed when there were two people and one person, that's really probably very interesting to the public. The ethics around the creatures is, very interesting. The ethics around fascism is, of course, right now very important to people and interesting to people. So it's like this movie does cover a lot of ground, which is one of the advantages of it not having a grand narrative. But you could pull from this movie a lot of different inspiration for different avenues to follow in your story once you start to kind of understand the moral psychology that exists underneath all of these kind of dynamics and the conflicts that exist in the film.
Yeah, I guess the thing I was trying to really emphasize about the difference between two Mickeys is that characters have their moral beliefs or their ethical axioms, like I believe this is good and this is bad, and then they also have these personality traits that influence how they enact their moral beliefs. So you can have characters be different in terms of what they believe or in how they what traits influence how they express that.
I see. So yeah, so I see what you were getting at there. I thought you were doing a summary. So yeah, basically like separating the beliefs from the traits of the character and looking at the traits as a sort of friction against, or not. It could be a friction, or it could be greasing the wheels of following those moral principles.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a general idea of something that you could use in your writing. There could be many different traits that prevent a person from doing the right thing. For instance, person could have low self-esteem, for instance. That could be a trait, but they could care a lot about justice, but then not have the confidence to pursue justice. And there's a whole bunch of aspects about the way that they behave around their low self-esteem. So just a way to, something from this movie to take away from it is to look at, okay, well, my characters, how do I actually provide this kind of friction of personality to create internal conflict between their virtues or their personality traits and their internal moral compass.
And I guess the last thing I'll say before we should probably wrap up is that this movie is an absurdist sci-fi kind of like farce almost. And I've been saying recently that like the sci-fi movies that got it the most right are the absurdist ones, because some of the stuff that's happening in the world is so bizarre that no serious sci-fi would even like put it in there, because it would just like break suspension of disbelief. But so like I would say, if you're a writer, consider taking off the brakes on how far you take like an idea. If you have an idea of like, here's something that is an interesting issue to explore, let me put it in some sci-fi or fantasy other world to see what happens. Consider like taking it a step further than what seems realistic and getting exaggerated with it, because I don't know, the world feels more and more like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to me.
Yeah.
All right. So any final concluding remarks?
No, I think that was what I had said at the end was a good summary of our full conversation.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you again.
Catch you later.